Yeah, so welcome to Rebug. We're going to dig into hot versus cold observables. So who knows what observables are? A couple of hands. So how would you describe an observable? What is it?
Stream.
It's a stream, okay. What else could you describe about it?
The schema that can be wired up to other parts of the schema.
Okay.
And the two stay in touch with each other.
Okay. Anything else? You guys heard maybe that it's promisey? Have you guys heard that?
Yeah.
Kind of like promises? Well, the really interesting thing about observables is they're really just functions. There's really not a whole lot of magic going on. So we're going to take a look at this tonight and start to understand observables a little bit more. We're going to kind of go back and forth between the slides here and look at some code and take a look at how would I actually create an observable if I want to do one on my own. And we're going to start to talk about the differences between hot versus cold observables and why you really need to understand this. Because as we start developing applications, we start to see we might start to see some really weird side effects that we're not really sure why this is occurring, but it's happening and there's really no logical reason for it. So we got hot and cold observables. First one we're going to talk about a little bit here is cold observables. That looks cold, I think. All right, so in the case here on a cold observable, in this case here we got a really simple example. We're using the RX observable interval, and this is going to fire off every second, and then we have two different sources subscribing to it. So it's really simple, right? Nice, simple, cold observable. We can come over here and take a look at, let's see if we can make this a little bigger. So if we look here, it's basically the two buttons, and we click, they're just going to call a subscribe method. If we go look at the subscribe, all it's doing is just subscribing to the source here. And so we'll go ahead and click subscribe on the first one, and we start to get some values, and so it's just firing off every second. We click the second one, and that one's, even though, notice here, we've got the same source, but we have two different sets of values firing here. So it's often confusing, like, well, why is this occurring? Now, if we really want to, up the ante, let's go ahead and just click subscribe on both of those. Now we've got a new mess. Like, oh, hold on, what just happened? Now we've got multiple values firing. Everything's out of sync. Why did this just happen? Okay. Go back to full screen here. So in this case, the observable is not sharing the same source here. Okay. So we're going to dig into this a little bit more here in a second. So cold observables start running on subscription. So you notice that no values actually started happening until I click subscribe. And you know this because the first value is what? 0, right? So it didn't actually happen until I call a subscribe. I click the button, it subscribes, it starts producing values. That may be great for you, and in some instances that's not what you want. You want to be able to pick up previous values or be able to have it start at a certain point, and then now we want to subscribe to it and start picking up the values from this point on, right? And as we noticed here, the values are not shared amongst the subscribers. So this might be okay for you. And in some instances, this is what you're going to want. You're going to want completely separate pieces. They're operating 100% independently. But there's a lot of cases where you don't want this to happen. If we're using a resource like a database and we're making REST API calls, and we've got two different lists of products, and it's really the same list of products, but maybe sorted differently. We're having to make it's making multiple calls out to go get the same thing. Now we're starting to chew up resources. Take it a step further. Now let's bring web sockets into the mix. Now we've just taken a resource that's really finite, and now we're using more of those. Every time we click subscribe, another WebSocket is used, and that can definitely create some problems for you. All right, so let's talk about hot observables. In this case here, we're doing something just slightly different. Notice that we're still got our source here. It's still doing the RX observable interval, and there's two different pieces here that you haven't seen yet. One is a publish, and the other one is connect. So let's take a quick look at what happens here when we execute this code. So in this case here, did I kill the right one? Oh, Oh, look at that. So we didn't start at 0. So now we notice we're in complete sync. They're sharing the same data. And if I go back and I click subscribe, nothing is actually happening different. Now what's actually happened is I actually have 6 subscriptions. They're all just displaying the same exact data. They're all sharing the same exact source. Okay, this is often what we want to have happen. And the previous example is what we end up getting because we don't understand what's actually underneath the covers and what's actually happening. So go back over here. All right, so by default, observables are cold or they're unicast. So they don't share the same producer. Multicast operators can be used to make an observable hot. So in our case here, if we go back a screen, when we did publish, that actually made it multicast. So that now allowed us to take this observable here, again, by default is cold. When we call publish on it, now it's making it hot. And then once we call connect, that's when we're saying, now start getting us values. So if you remember, if we go back over here to, just take it out of full screen real quick. Exit full screen. And we come back over here. If we refresh, and again, we wait 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. You can see now we're getting values further along. What's actually happened here, if we look at the code on this, is we've created our const source, and we've called publish on it, and immediately we call source connect. So now it's made it a multicast. It is now a hot observable. So we've taken something that's cold and now made it hot.
So connect started your interval?
Exactly. That's when it starts. Okay. Come back over here. All right, so let's talk about some of these multicast functions. So publish, that's the one that we just looked at. It returns a connectable observable, which it's a type of observable, and it waits until the connect method is called before it starts emitting items to the observers that have subscribed to it. So there's some great documentation here over on the Learn RxJS.io site. So we can go look at multicasting really quick over here. Let's blow this up just a little bit. And so in this case here, they have a very simple, similar example. So in the case, they start out with calling Rx observable interval. Notice that we're not doing publish. We're not doing anything special with it. And then we're setting our example source equals. We're going to do a do so that we can do this log statement. Everybody see that? Is that big enough? Make that maybe just a little bit bigger. So we've got our do statement here. And then the next thing that we do is we call publish. So what's going to happen is down here we're creating 2 different subscriptions. And the first thing it's going to fire is our do something. And then we have subscriber 1. So when he gets a value back, he's going to call this. And then subscriber 2. So they're both of those values are going to be 0. And then we're going to call the example connect and on a 5-second delay, and then that's when it's going to fire these values again. So basically nothing really happens. Even though we call the publish, it's not actually emitting new events. Nothing's actually firing until we actually get down here and we call example.connect, and now boom, now we're actually firing the example, and that's when we get this second one right here. Okay. We'll close that one out, come back over here. So then the other one is multicast. So this shares the source using the provided subject. So this one's a really interesting example as well. Let me go to F12. Nope, not that. View. Oh, there we go. Full screen. So in this case here, we're doing the same exact interval. It's going to call a take 5 on it first. We're going to go ahead and set up our map 2, or our do and our map 2. So then we call example multicast. which creates or calls and creates a new Rx subject. From here, make sure I got this right. And we can actually watch how this is working. That's the piece I'm missing here. So we'll actually pull this up on the JS bin. All right. So what's initially happened here is we're calling our console log for side effect 2, and that's firing each time that we create a new subscriber here. And then you can see that it's returning those values there. Hold on a second here. I think that's done, or it's going to fire again in 5 seconds. So in effect here, multicast is just a new way to create an Rx subject, which then I believe shares the, go back over here, escape. As I said over here, it shares the source using the provided subject. Share is also like multicast with a subject and a ref count, so you can use this if you want to figure out how many refs are occurring. And again, you can start to shape this observable a little bit more and how you want it to work. So the magic here in the understanding comes from, let's actually flip back over to here. Nope. All right, we'll come back. Okay, this is actually the screen that we want here. So really what's happening here, when we're creating an observable between a cold and a hot, is really where the producer lives, okay? So if you want to create an observable on your own and not actually use some of these multicast functions, share functions, whatnot, you can create it on your own if you want. The big difference here, notice on the cold, it's got the observable and we create the producer on the inside. The producer is anything that's emitting values. Okay, so in our case here, we've been using this interval object, right, off the observable, and it's firing off the timeout, and we're getting values from that. On the hot, what we've done is we actually remove the producer outside of the observable, and then the producer then is now shared. The disadvantage of doing it this way is now I actually have to manage the producer. So I actually have to now do some ref counting, make sure how many people have subscribed to this. And that way, especially like let's say the producer is a WebSocket, I need to make sure all of those get shut back down. So you can do this manually, and there's some ways, you can actually build a class that will do this for you, but you end up with a huge footprint to be able to do it versus just going ahead and writing it as a cold. And then making it hot using one of those 3 functions, multicast, share, or the other one. So this is usually the recommended is allow it to be cold and then use those functions. In certain cases, though, if you want it to be hot, you'd want to do this. So one of the other things I want to show you about observables, we said at the start here that they're just functions. And so one of the things I wanted to show you is, let's see here. It's just not wanting to let me get at a full screen. Let's see here. Let me get back to there we go. We've got a link. The problem is I think they're both in full screen, and I've gotten myself sort of locked in. There we go. All right. So there's a really great article here about learning observables by building observables. So this is a great article on what does it actually take to create an observable and how do they actually work. So really the best thing to do is look at the JS bin here and see what's going on. So in this case here, we've created a data source. This is our producer, right? So our producer here, this is just a data source. It's going to emit an event, and on that you notice it's got an on data and it's got an on complete. In this case here, all we're doing is just doing an interval piece, so there's really no on error, that any sort of error that this thing would throw, but we could, add that as well. And so in the case here, it's got the emit basically looks and says, okay, I've got a limit of 10. If we've got an on data method, then call it. and if we're equal to the limit, then we're going to call the onComplete. So then from there, so this is our producer. This is where we're getting our emitter, our data from. So this could be, an HTTP service. This could be, a WebSocket. This could be anything, right? In our case here, then we want to create our observable, where we're going to create an instance of our data source. This is where we're getting our data from. And then we're actually going to go ahead and set. Now notice we're passing the observer into it. And we'll come back to that in just a second. But we're taking that observer and we're setting the data sources on data equal to the observer next, and mapping the on error to the error and the on complete to complete. So you're like, well, what do those values come from? How does this actually getting wired up? Well, down here we're actually creating the observable, creating an instance of it, and this is what we're a fairly common thing to go. Okay, well, here's our three functions. We've got a next function, an error function, and a complete function. Okay, and so these are what are actually going to get called by the observable. So we'll tie this back in just a second, but when the observer calls next, it's going to fire on data, which is then going to fire, the on data is going to get called, which is going to fire the next here, which is going to just log the value, right? So that's how we got our values here. And what's actually happening here is as it's calling emit, it checks to see if it has an on data function. It goes ahead and calls it, okay? And so that's really all an observable is. It's really nothing awfully, really that complicated, but allows us to be able to handle, the emission of data, any sort of errors, and then once it hits complete, notice we went ahead and stopped. So, any questions on that with the observable itself? So it's a really simple example, but from this you can actually create any sort of data source that you wanted to work with, and you'd be able to create an observable that could be reused and subscribed to, and you get your values from. Really, really simple. So, and then let's see here, come back over here. So the HTTP service returns a cold observable, so that means that each subscription results in a new request. So this is the most common problem that we see, is that we're bringing observables in, we're making an HTTP call, we pull up a page, and all of a sudden it's made 3 calls to the same exact data source, and we don't know why. The same exact method was called to go get the same piece of data, and it's like, well, do we have a subscription problem, or what's going on here? So in our case here, we're going to take a look here in just a second on an observable example. And the HTML is super, super simple. It's nothing more than we've got a observable here that's being piped through an async. So that just wraps that in a subscription. When that goes ahead and it fires, then the heroes will go ahead and render, right? And so in our case here, we want to have 2 different ones. And, okay, let's go over to the example code here. So we should be able to go to localhost 4200, and I've got 2 really small links there. So the first one is cold. So if you look at it, it's like, all right, well, that doesn't seem too special. So I'll go ahead and pull up the developer tools here, and we'll go ahead and refresh it. And what I want to look for is on the network tab, heroes. So this may not make sense right at the moment. We'll go ahead and switch over to the code window, and we're going to dig into the examples, and we're going to look at the cold example here. And I'm going to have to switch this over to presentation mode. That's a little bigger. So in the case here, let's see here. We've got heroes, which is declared as an observable, type any, and we set this heroes equals to a get. So we're only doing this once on the ng init, right? Seems pretty simple here, and we're loading just a JSON file. From that, we're mapping to get the JSON from the response, and then setting the heroes equals to the heroes key with the return JSON, right? So what's actually happening though, when we we come back over here, as we notice it's loaded it twice. But we only loaded it once. Okay, so here's where the confusion comes in. If we look at the actually, boom. All right, if we look at the HTML here, what we've done is we've got two async pipes. Well, those wrap each one of those heroes in a subscription. Okay, an observable, and then that's what we're going to subscribe to when that resolves. Then it's going to pipe it into JSON, right? So what's happening here, just like we saw in that very first example, we had two subscribe buttons on a cold. It's using two different sets of values. It's not sharing the producer. So by not sharing the producer, what happens is now we're making twice as many calls, even though we're using the same exact data. Does that make sense? So in a case here, what often will happen is we'll be running our app and it looks like we've got some sort of performance issue or some sort of bug, and it's really actually observables behaving exactly the way that they're intended to behave. So in a case here, does anyone have an idea how we might fix this? Convert it to a hot. Absolutely. That way we can wrap it as many times as we want. With this async pipe, and we could do 100 of these, and it's still only going to go load it once. So let's take a look at that really quick. Now we're going to go look at the hot, and we can see here, we'll actually just do a hard refresh here. You can see that heroes only got loaded once. Okay, so the big difference here is coming back over onto the, actually in this case here, here's the hot component. We've done the share on this, and then that allows us to go ahead and we'll share the same data source, the same producer, right? So we're not now going out and loading the same thing multiple times. Can you imagine an application where you might be displaying the same data in multiple fashions? It might just be, like, again, sorted slightly different or displayed a little bit different. Or let's say it's permissions. Like a permissions is a great example that I might be sharing across multiple components, and then those components then would all start loading their own, even though it's already been loaded, by the parent. So those are things that we want to watch out for with observables. So let's see here. I think that's actually really it for our observable presentation so far. Does anybody have any questions on it? All right.
When is it advised to use the share method versus the publish?
I believe it's the, if you go look at the documentation, we flip back over here. That was not the one, multicast. Okay, so we've got the three different ones here. It's really, part of it's based on the subject. Part of what you could do, let's say if you wanted to have it where, let's see, the example I think is that let's say we fire off connect and we've got one that's firing each time, and we want to subscribe another one, but we want to get all the old values, all the previous values, even though I'm getting to the party late. I still want to have, all the values that have been emitted before. Then that'd be one reason. So you'd be using, I believe, it's a good question. I know shared gets you the that's the subject with the ref count versus, Adam, do you know on that which one you'd use? You weren't paying attention. All right. So the question is that when would I use publish versus multicast versus share? And I think the one, like publish is the most simple version of it. When you just want it to make it, you want to share the source and make it hot by calling connect. Share, I believe what's happening here is you don't even actually have to call connect with it. It goes ahead and shares it, and it creates a new subject, which then you can do some more stuff with. Let's see here. Okay, so like here's a good example. In this case here, we go ahead and start off with our example equals source, and we're going to go ahead and side effect and map it to a result. So we start to see immediately when we subscribe these two pieces, it's going to fire off side effect, result, right? Side effect, result from here. It has two separate values or two separate sources because it's still cold at this point. In this case here on share, when we call it, we don't have to do connect. We can jump into it late like this. And now once we actually call connect and we subscribe, so in this case here, look, we call examples share, and we actually get a new subject. Subjects work just like observables. They look and feel like it. They just have a few more methods. You can do a few more things with them. In this case here, I go ahead and subscribe to the shared example, and what happens is we get a side effect once, and now result. So each of them now getting a result from it.
So if you have multiple subscribers, is there any reason why it shouldn't always be hot?
So the question is that if we have multiple subscribers, is there a reason why you wouldn't always want it to be hot? It's a good question. It really depends on the application and what you're wanting to do. If you want the data to be shared and that resource to be shared, then you want it hot. You don't want to allow it to go out and use up more resources, make more database calls. And let's say in the case of intervals and other data that might be coming in, you might want to have each one of those have its own instance of the data so they can act completely independently. So that's really going to be driven by the requirements. The problem that I see here is that people think that they should be operating like they're hot, but they're actually operating cold, and then they don't understand the result that they're getting. And then it looks like we start to create new performance issues because we don't really see what's going on underneath the covers, and we don't understand that it's getting two different producers, and we don't have the same data technically.
So I guess my first reaction when I see this is like, in the traditional Tour of Heroes example, why wouldn't I want my hero service to always produce a hot observable, right? So you know what I'm saying?
No, I think that's great. I think in the cases where you've only got one on the page and it's only being loaded once, then it's really not a big deal. You don't have to worry about it. Why take the performance hit to say, hey, I'm going to protect myself. I'm always going to be hot. Always going to have hot observables. Well, there's overhead to everything. When we change it to a hot, it's wrapping it with another layer. Is it really going to affect the performance? Maybe not on a small application. Maybe on a really big one, though. It definitely could. So I think you look at it in a case-by-case basis. If we're starting to use the same observable multiple times on one page, and we start to notice this, okay, hold on, we got a problem here. This is not the effect that we wanted. So I think it's really case-by-case. Louis, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm maybe a little late to the game. I went through the Tour of Heroes stuff and building something in Angular too. And I haven't run into anything where I'm like, gosh, I have a problem, I can't solve it, and maybe Observables is it. So because Angular or whatever, there's so much stuff to learn up front, TypeScript, the Webpack stuff, the difference in syntax and everything. It's difficult to know how much you should learn up front and then switch to actually doing. So I guess my question is, for observables, what problem am I eventually going to run into where I really do need observables? Is it mostly async stuff and just?
Yeah, I mean, the initial things where people start using observables almost out of the gate is HTTP calls, because we got to go get some data from somewhere, right? Eventually, or we want to save something off. And so that's usually where we start to run into our first experience with it. And then, we start to go, today's not quite what I want, because the database guys, they never write it the way I want it. I want to morph it so that I can get it to look the way I want. So I'll use hey, there's this map thing, man, I can do this real quick. And then you start chaining a few things together. You see a few examples about how you might approach stuff. That's going to be your first. Then it starts, as you're building an application, in my opinion, you just start to see these side effects that you weren't really anticipating. You're like, I don't really get why that call is being hit 5 times. Because now we're loading, we're sharing data between components. We're doing different things like that, with a component. And also we start to get some really unaccounted for side effects that we're like, why? And this is usually a good starting point. Take a look at, hey, are we running into a case where we think we've only got one, it should only be loading once, but man, it's just wrapping those asyncs, and it's just firing against the database and bringing our servers down. I would say if you start into Redux, then you're really going to get into observables. Everything's going to be an observable at that point for you, and And that's a really good starting point as well to understand architectures like that. And then I would really recommend digging into like this article here on how to create observables. You know, they talk a little bit about how to you can use this thing called a safe observer, and what actually makes up a safe observer. Um, you know, and they've got just the implementation of it. They've got one that's just horrendous. Um, Example, and I think this is one of them where, yeah, this is the safe observer. If you had to recreate this and handle some ref counting and stuff like that, I believe this was the one here for that. But they walk you through a few more examples. It's really just understanding what makes up an observable, what makes it different than promises, you know, and just really getting the basics of them is what I would recommend.
You know, another thing too is if you work with Firebase, it kind of has this concept of pushing. Rather than always requesting and pulling, it can actually push data out. And observables are really good at handling that kind of thing when you're getting data at moments where you don't necessarily know you're about to get data.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So yeah, Firebase and stuff like that, where you're connected to an observable and it's pushing you data, emitting data, just a different emitter, right? Just a different data producer for you. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, so what are the differences between observables and promises, and when would you prefer one over the other?
AngularJS, promises, observables for Angular and going forward. You might use promises, let's say with node code, you know, I believe like ES6, you can do promises as well, and there's some stuff there. But really for, Angular and front end code, you pretty much would be going with the observables. You can, I believe with the observable library, you can make stuff into promises into observables, and I think can you go the other way as well? I believe, and you can go down some fun roads with that, I guess. But ideally, in my mind, you'd want to learn observables, use observables, especially when you start getting into Redux, where you're going to stop having components go load their own data. And you start to understand now that we're going to create a variable that is an observable type, and it's going to point to the store. And in that store, it's going to point to, let's say it's products or it's customers or, maybe it's a single customer record. And then when that object changes based on some of the event that's firing off here or over there, that I don't have to go worry about it. All of a sudden, boom, I know to redraw. So it's going to be wrapped in that with that async pipe in an observable and an automatically change. So
I read a forum on this, and there's a contention between should I use promises and be very specific, right? And this is a promise, versus use an observable, which it has promise aspects to it, but so much more. And the answer, according to that forum, was that the overhead that you get from the observable is only slightly more than if you just use a promise. And so, unless you know for sure that is the only promise, like that is all it will ever be throughout the entire life of the app, then go ahead and use a promise. But if you're continuously developing, why not just start in an observable? And then that way in the future, you don't have to worry about, oh, I've got another subscriber. Hey, I need to manage the cleanup. So just put it in an observable, and then you're good for the life of the app.
Adam?
Yeah, I was going to make the same point. Basically, a promise is a type of observable, a specific type of observable that only have remits once. So if you look like, at libraries like NGRX, I think is what Jesse was getting at with Redux. Like Redux it's not opinionated in any way about whether or not you're using observables or promises, but an implementation like NGRX is built on observables, and it's intended to be a reusable library, so they favor the observable interface because it's the most flexible. If you were building an app potentially, and all of your developers are more comfortable with promises, the form that Bill was alluding to referencing. Is this idea of if you don't make that decision, you're providing the most flexibility in your APIs. So if you look at all the public APIs in the Angular framework, they're all going to return for async operations.
And what I like about observables as well is that I can do a lot of data manipulation. I can map it. I can work with that data and return it out. Where it's not quite as easy and as systematic as it is like with promises. That's a little bit tougher to do. Where with observables, it's a nice, easy chain. I can map, whatever it is that I need to do to the data so I can get it in the form that I want. Lots of different manipulations that we can do. So.
The main difference between promise and observable. Promise is, like say, it's an event that happens in the future is one, and it's only one.
Oh, that's a good point as well, yeah.
It could be one, or it could be a stream of events, and it may or may not ever complete. So it's more of a more general solution, I think. The other thing is promises are not cancelable. We're discussing whether they should be, but so for example, if you make a request and you get a result back, someone navigates away, you're still going to get that result. You have to handle it. But with observables, you can just subscribe as soon as they navigate away. You don't have to deal with canceling. So I think reasons you want to use observables are if you're doing an HTTP call, generally, it's not just enough to try it once and be done. A lot of times you need a retry. So like if it doesn't work properly the first time, and then observables are better than promises because of that. It's actually really trivial to retry with observable, and it's a lot more complicated. Especially if you say, well, I want to retry 4 times, 3 times, or 10 times. That is really trivial and observable, but it's a lot more work than promise because you have to create a promise for each try. Also in an animation, it's pretty typical to say, based on some user action, I want to cancel the animation, right? Because they're moved on something. That's hard to do with promises, but it's trivial to do. Not a lot of things are trivial to do with observables, but those things in particular are a lot easier to do with observables.
Yeah, that was a great point. So reusable multiple times, right, is what we covered there.
There's actually an operator.
Well, where a promise only fires once, an observable can handle multiple emissions of data coming to it. There's the cancelable part of it, and then the retry part as well, right?
Well, retry is just another operator.
Yep.
And
Okay.
so you can chain that with other operators, like filters and stuff like that. But where you're doing the promises, you actually have to create a promise per retry. And those end up nested, right, usually. And that's a mess, right? So you never have to do that. A good example is like, try to implement type ahead with a promise and try to implement it with observables. Type ahead's like when you're Google and you type 3 letters and it does a search for you, it brings back the result. And then you type 2 more letters and it gives you another result.
Yep.
Try to do that with promises and try to do it with observables, and we'll see why observables are in that way superior.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I miss from promises is the Christmas tree effect of going all the way to one edge of the page and all the way back to the other one.
That's because you're doing your own.
well, that too, but that's for another meetup.
So another thing too is that those, you mentioned the operators themselves, for instance, you can build your own operators for RxJS that do what you need it to do.
Yeah, there's some great articles out there on building your own operators and really how simple that is to do, and being able to manipulate data and then return it right back out. It's really nice to be able to chain, operator after operator together. Makes it really simple for doing this kind of stuff.